Let me try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is October 4th, 2011, and this is the second time we're meeting. And we worked on a few things this week. I looked at your discussion boards. There were some spirited discussions. I want to give you a little feedback on the discussion boards. The discussion boards where I think for Learning Module 2. And you did your Learning Project 1. And I've graded all of that. So if you went on Blackboard today, and I know many of you are busy and you didn't get to check Blackboard yet, but those of you who did, you ought to see your grades on your homepage. And all of those were done. Don't get used to it. I don't always grade things so promptly. On the other hand, I'm not going to make you wait weeks. But they were due yesterday at 10, and they were graded by 9 o'clock this morning. So that's, you can't get much better than that, right? Nevertheless, I endeavor to try to grade your work promptly. The comments I have on the discussion board are not even substantive, and I made a few snarky posts about better titles, you know, and I'm not so sure I impressed this class with that fact. I'm not so sure I made that quite clear to this group. I know I made it quite clear to the online group, and sometimes I mix up a little bit what I've said to each group. But we're kind of on the same track right now, so if ever I say didn't I tell you that and you know I didn't, then just remind me of that and I'll realize that I didn't communicate that to this group. But I don't think that should happen much going forward. And that is that when you post in the discussion board, try to give the title of your post something that differentiates it from all the other posts. And to simply say Module 2 or Learning Module 2 or LM2 doesn't quite cut it for a few reasons. You know, we want you to be clever in your posts. We want you to think about the theme of your post, right? What's the point you're trying to make? And that's what ought to be in the title. But more importantly, as a professor and someone who has to grade these posts and look at them, when you look at a blob of 50 posts in one long scrolling series of threads, and they all say Module 2, LM2, Learning Module 2, it's hard for me to figure out who's replying to who and what post is related to what post. Now, there are ways I can look at them sequentially, but it's better if you name your post something that captures the essence of what you said. And it doesn't have to be high art. It just needs to be something that captures the essence of what you're saying. You know, other than that, some of your observations were very good, and it was rather spirited, and I hope that that continues. It gets people thinking. It gets people talking. It gets you thinking and talking about things that you may not have contemplated before when it comes to the early stages of your learning process with regard to forensic interviewing of children. We're going to look at some video clips, and I think it was, is it Jalissa? Yeah, where you had some commentary about the forensic interviews, and I explained what the interviewers were attempting to do. Did you see my response? And then one of your fellow students came up with a better way to ask that question. And what I'm referring to is Jalissa said that in the second, we'll see those samples in a minute, but there's a video clip where I am emphasizing how literal children can be and how we need to be precise and we need to be vigilant in paying attention to how they are reacting to our question formulations. And in that clip, to the boy, underwear and boxers were two different things. We tend to categorize them because we're grown-ups under the same general term. Undergarments, underwear. To me, underwear includes boxers and briefs and boxer briefs and anything else that people wear under their clothes. But to him, underwear were, I guess, tighty-whities or briefs. I don't know what he meant, to tell you the truth. But he didn't mean boxers. To him, boxers were something different than underwear. I don't quite know what he meant by underwear, but they were something different. And that's that kind of literal precision that defines how kids about that age think about the world around them. One of the examples that I remember early in my career in forensic interviewing and child maltreatment was a child who was asked whether they lived in a house or an apartment, and they were puzzled by that because they didn't live in either. Some kids live in a trailer or a wide, what do they call them? Double wide, or the projects. And that's what they call the place that they live. Not a house, nor an apartment. Now, as they grow up, they learn more words that define their experiences, and they have a bigger vocabulary. And language and children's literal responses and their literal reaction or responses to our questions can confound an interview, right? I mean, if we're not talking the same language or we're misunderstanding what they're trying to communicate to us, then we're going to get a skewed or distorted outcome, right? If he says, I never had on any boxers, and then we write in our report, or we ask questions based upon the assumption that he wears pants with no underwear, the outcome of our interview is distorted or confounded. It's not an accurate understanding of what really happened. And it's never the child's fault. I think I made this point last week. It's our fault. When I say our, it's the interviewer's fault. When we're not on the same page, we can't expect the child to let us know. We need to be vigilant for indicators in their responses or the dynamics of how the interview is going. Anyway, back to the discussion board. Julissa made the observation that it seemed that the boy was confused and that the interviewer injected that kind of confusion and misunderstanding into the interview, and she did. On the other hand, the kind of question that the interviewer was asking was a good question, not the best. What the interviewer was struggling to do was ask a question that wasn't leading or suggestive as to underwear. And, you know, one of the ways that this particular interviewer, that's Giselle Enriquez, attempts to do that is by saying, well, how were your underwear when this happened? But that how word isn't the right word. And one of you suggested, why doesn't she simply say, where were your underwear? Go ahead, take credit for that. Who suggested that? Thank you, thank you. And I said, yes, I like that. Sometimes the simple things are right in front of you, right? It accomplishes what I was talking about. It doesn't make the assumption about underwear or that they were on or off or something else. See, underwear is a big thing in our field, right? Underpants, pants, state of undress is a big thing, right? Over the clothes, under the clothes. These are big issues in investigations of child maltreatment, specifically child sexual abuse. These things are the difference sometimes between 20 years in prison or 5 years in prison. They are the difference between a serious trauma and perhaps a less serious trauma on a child. The level of intrusion or the intrusiveness of the offense impacts not only the potential punishment in the criminal area, but can also impact the quality of the trauma on the child. Now, there's not a direct correlation, and there are other things that matter when measuring quality of trauma, more than the intrusiveness. But intrusiveness is part of it. Relationship is the biggest thing that one needs to worry about. And I often say this to defense lawyers and to judges when we are discussing a criminal prosecution and how serious it is. Because I often get, you know, lawyers, we discuss these things in the judge's office before we go out on the record. A lot of what you see is almost like reality TV. It's scripted and choreographed, and we kind of know what we're doing. Not doing a trial. A trial is, you know, it goes in whatever direction it goes. But when we make statements on the record, or we argue bail motions, or we argue motions to dismiss the charges, you know, a lot of the issues have already been tossed about in the judges' chambers. And that's good because, we want to find out whether we can resolve this case without having to litigate. That's in everyone's interest. And we talk about that in Children in Justice. But often when I'm in chambers with the defense lawyer, I hear things like, Judge, this was over the clothes. He grabbed her breasts like 3 or 4 times on top of her blouse. I mean, come on, this is not a big deal. Now, we know it is a big deal. Any kind of touching is intrusive. But there's some appeal in that, right? It's certainly not a big deal, not as big a deal as somebody who's sodomized, right, who's anally penetrated. I can appreciate that, when you deal with a lot of these cases, there are some cases that are horrific and there are some cases that are less terrible. They're all bad, but you need to evaluate relative badness in what we do, especially in the criminal justice system. But to suggest it wasn't a big deal solely based upon the level of intrusiveness, whether the clothes were on or off or whether there was a penetration or not, really misses the boat about trauma and betrayal and exploitation. Because I would suggest that a woman who is digitally penetrated or fingered against her will, without her permission, in a nightclub or in a fraternity house, okay, not a pleasant experience. Criminal, may have trauma that needs to be treated, dealt with, but I would suggest that in quality of trauma, it is certainly possible, perhaps probable, that a father who fondles his daughter's breasts over the clothes on top of her blouse 2 or 3 times can have a far more traumatic impact than that young woman who gets fingered in the frat house. Because the relationship is often what ratchets up the trauma. The betrayal, the exploitation, being taken advantage of by your own father can have a far more lasting effect than having your body penetrated by someone without your permission. Again, don't get me wrong, I'm not, both situations are bad. But I think that these defense lawyers really miss the boat when they focus on level of intrusiveness and don't pay attention to the relationship between the parties. A single fondle of a female daughter's breast can affect that young lady, unfortunately, for the rest of her life in ways deep and difficult to remedy. Whereas a far more intrusive event might not be as lasting or might not be as deep when it comes to the trauma experienced by the victim. So back to the discussion boards and back to what I was talking about with regard to the kinds of questions. What we're attempting to do is ask questions about level of intrusiveness. That's why I began talking about that, right? Whether the clothes were on or off or something else, whether the underpants were on or off or something else, are big questions. They really mean something in child maltreatment investigations. So we struggle to ask questions that don't suggest the answer. And you will learn later, we will talk about this when we talk about language, that there is nearly always another option when you ask a multiple choice question. Was it night or day? Was it on or off? Was the door open or closed? Did you have your watch on or off? Nearly all multiple choice questions you can think up have a possibility that's not among the choices, that you didn't think of. That's why we recommend saying, or something else. That's why that interviewer wanted to ask a question that did not imply or suggest anything about the underpants. We don't want to give the answer. We don't want to dangle the answer out there. We want to be as open-ended as possible. So rather than saying, were your underpants on or off or something else, which is mildly suggestive because we're bringing up, well, underpants and that they might not have been on or off or that they were in disarray or they weren't where they were supposed to be. Where a question like, how were your underpants when this was happening, doesn't suggest that they were in disarray or off or somewhere else or things like that. But the equally simple question, and perhaps less confusing, is where were your underwear? Kids have a tough time with where, who, how, and all of these questions, but I feel that where is more solid than how. How is usually offered up in a different context. Usually how precedes a question of the mechanics of getting something done. You know, how do you make chocolate milk, you know? How do you get from Dixon Hall to College Hall? Whereas where implies location and direction. So where were your underpants might be a little bit more connected with the child's ability at that time. So that was suggested in the discussion boards. And that's why discussion boards are good. They get you talking and thinking and interacting. And I'm telling you, the only way to not get 2 points in a discussion board is don't post. Then you'll get 0. Or post once, you'll get 1 point. It's a real simple equation. Or say, that's cool, ... Obviously, that's as if you didn't post. There's no right or wrong, there's just being engaged. And you don't have to give Del Russo a new way to ask questions or something profound. You just need to be engaged. And you did a good job of that, everyone. Now, Learning Project 1 was very interesting. Both this cohort and the online group are, like I said a moment ago, on the same track, and I looked at the responses from both classes. You got 10 points simply by doing this exercise. And the reason why you get 10 points for simply doing the exercise is because I think that by doing the exercise, you're learning. You're interacting with kids. You're asking kids questions that are beyond their competence, and you're watching how they react. Even the I don't knows are instructive. Even the frustrated kids are instructive. And we're asking questions about things that are relevant to the legal system. Now, it's very rare that anyone is going to ask a kid what the word bailiff means or why the judge wears a black robe. But again, my point here in this exercise is to get you students thinking about 7 and 6 and 8-year-olds, how they respond to questions that are beyond their abilities, what kind of faces they make, what kind of frustration they evidence, what kind of speculations they engage in, what kind of confidence they answer with sometimes when they do answer confidently. And I know most, if not all of you, are child protection workers. Not all of you, but most of you are. And you talk to kids every day. But I have to start out, because this is an overview, a forensic interview, I have to start out assuming that you don't talk to kids every day. So to those of you who interacting with 7 and 6-year-olds is old hat, well, perhaps these kinds of questions and this kind of exercise still was helpful. And of course, kids say the darndest things, right? To quote Art Linkletter from the 70s or 60s and whenever. And Bill Cosby used to run entire television shows based upon kids' wacky responses. Yeah, here are some of them, and you may be able to see them on the board. It doesn't matter. I just put them up there because you're looking at what I'm looking at on this MacBook. What is a courtroom? It's where the courts are and it's locked. Okay. A bed. I went there when I got my family. Okay. Clearly there's a kid here that's in the system. There's a couple other responses that are system-like responses, and that's okay. It's just interesting to see how they conceptualize these legal system issues and questions that involve the legal system based upon their experience in the legal system. And by the way, I was saying you get 10 points for simply doing the exercise because I think the exercise is instructive in and of itself. Moreover, I think the next discussion board or the one after that, I think it's the next one, you're going to be asked to comment about these things and look up a couple of terms that have to do with linguistics. And I'm not sure if my next lecture is on children and language. It may be, but it will be after that children and language exercise that I want you to review and revisit these things. I'm going to give you a spreadsheet with dozens of responses from a different class. And you will do this discussion board, one or two discussion boards later. And we'll talk about these things. But I want to chat a little bit about it now as well. Excuse me. And you will hearken back to your own experience with your kid or your children when you do that discussion board. So you got your 10 points if you did this, and then we're going to revisit this by looking at a spreadsheet with responses from a larger group. What is a jury? Something that people wear on their wrists. Don't know. Is it germs? Let's stop for a minute. Something that people wear on their wrists. What do you think that's all about? Jewelry. Now, when children hear a word, but they don't understand the meaning of it, they can connect it up to something that is relevant to them or something they do understand. But their responses will be erroneous, right? We're not on the same page here. The lesson here is some kids won't tell us that they don't know what the word means. They will simply move forward based upon their erroneous understanding of the word. They call this, and I think I asked you to look this up in that discussion board, an auditory discrimination error. Okay? When they take a word that they don't understand, they don't tell us they understand. Or they may not even know they don't understand. They may hear it as jewelry. But what's happening is either consciously or subconsciously, they are connecting up that word to one that approximates something that's in their life or that they do know the meaning of. And that's what's happening here, it seems to me. And you'll see more of that. Now, is it germs? That may be an auditory discrimination error or something else. I haven't really figured that one out yet. Have you? Jewelry, germs, is it germs? Not sure what's going on there. A sentence that goes through your mind. Unusual response, I'm not sure what that means. A person who creates rainbows. Anybody got anything on that? Jury? Is that some cartoon character that we're unaware of, or some rainbow maker, or some part of the Peter Pan tale that I'm not familiar with? Like a thing you can put something inside. Jury. Yeah, maybe a jewelry box. A funny person. Maybe jury, jerky, I don't know. Joker. Why do they have a Bible in court? So God can help them get out of prison if they make bad mistakes. God can help them. They put books in there like a library, so they have something to read. What's a Bible? I'm just thinking, probably so they know it's a workout room. Now, I think this child had sports responses every time. So this child, the word court, you see where the breakdown is? We're thinking Bible is what's confusing him, but court could be confusing him. Why do they have a Bible in a basketball court or a tennis court or whatever court he thinks it is? You see, so it's not the Bible. Yeah, he may know what a Bible is, although he says, what's a Bible? And I think it is a boy, but... Well, there it is again. So the basketball court won't fall. And maybe he thinks a Bible is a foundation or something. What is a defendant? When you are bad and smart. Well, that's interesting one, right? Perhaps. When you have to go to get something, like you left your jacket at school. Yeah, I was trying to figure that one out before. I'm not sure. That was your child? Any sense of?
No, I mean, he had church that morning, so, and he said that he left his jacket at church and he had to go back, so I don't know.
Okay, so it's probably just felt compelled to give you a response. A defender like Batman.
That's cute.
Yeah, and you know what? We need to be mindful of the root of the word, right? They see defend in there. Again, they're looking at something that's relevant to their world, and and they come up with their own understanding. The person who defends who is getting in trouble. Well, that's an astute definition. It's pretty much correct. It's for clothes, a defendant. What do you think it might be?
Fence.
A fence? Oh, maybe you hang your clothes on the fence? Defense?
Oh.
The fence?
Yeah.
Maybe. Excellent. No, I see. Like you can put a picture, what a judge tells people not to do anymore. When you defend yourself, the one that tries to kill you. I don't.
Wow.
A person who cannot hear. Yeah, defendant. A defendant. Right? But remember, I asked you to write what their responses were, and then I said, if they don't know, then say, well, what do you think it means? And when you get into what do you think it means, kids are prone to get fanciful, or could get fanciful. But here, this is the response they gave to the question. That's as similar to a forensic interview question as it can be. You ask them what it means, they give you an answer. What is a prosecutor? A security guard? Okay. A person who executes people by sticking a needle in their arm. Is that someone in here's kid? Okay.
Wow.
Watches a lot of TV.
Lethal injection.
The police that stand in the bank just in case the person tries to run. It's electricity or a kind of computer. Now, where do you think the kid's tracking off? Processor and computer, right? Prosecutor, computer. A scary person in a courthouse? Perhaps to the defendants on Monday morning, yeah, I'm sure. To Amanda Knox, that was a scary person for 5 years or however long she was in the Italian jail. It either means someone is cute or it's like a computer. Again, we got the computer kind of built in there, and we got the cute prosecutor. Now that child is very astute, there's no doubt about that. He kills people for their beliefs. I read about it in Sunday school. I think I can figure out that one though. What do you think that child is? Yeah, maybe a persecutor. Persecutor or persecutes the Israelites, or I don't know. A person that follows God, a brain scanner, a backyard, a woman who works outside.
Oh, right. She's working. Wow. That is deep.
What about an affidavit? Sounds like a dog. An affidavit is helping other people who are not as smart as you. Don't know. You go after David. Then we got to you go after David? With after David? Sounds like after David. That's reasonable. The family member of a jail person. It sounds like a plant to me. I had an idea about what they meant. Do you? Affidavit? Daffodil. That's what I was kind of thinking of. It kind of has that rhythm, affidavit, daffodil. in the Dafa, a tropical animal. Something that says nobody's going to scare you. It's like a dance. A person who lives in Africa. Africa, David. A verdict. A verdict is a victim, a teacher that is smarter than you, an animal that starves and dies. I've heard of it in school. Maybe someone who tests the weather. Anybody got any ideas? Verdict, weather tester, verdict. I heard about it in school. Weather meteorologist. Means you can do something like play or exercise and then carry a baby. It's like a vacuum cleaner but has no buttons. I'm not sure the connection between that and verdict, but I like the imagery. Seems very cool. Steve Jobsian or Apple. It's an eye vacuum. No buttons. That one's strange. What is an oath? Oath is a man, a person that helps you, a phone, a body part, a tree. What do you think that's related to, a tree? Oak. And that is an auditory discrimination error, right? Jewelry, jury. Oath, oak. Orphan. Means like you can ride a bike and have fun. Somebody that works in a big, huge building, a kind of building. Something you drink out of. Something I eat for breakfast. Maybe oats or oatmeal. Why do judges wear black robes? Because they could know karate. Because he's like a priest. If someone's sick or dying, he's going to help them. Well, I think there's some wisdom in that. I mean, this is a silly question. It's not really relevant to their experience in the courtroom, other than they may see a judge and ask themselves this, so no one can see them, just in case, because they don't want to get shot. They don't wear black robes, they wear black pants. My assistant said this is the sports kit. What do judges do? They like to march. They go on a bus and drive. They stand outside and watch the game. Stand on the side and watch the game. And this one here, he says, when I can go visit my dad. That's obviously a child in the system. I saw some others there that weren't here, and it was interesting because it seemed like their responses had to do with pop culture when they said things like, they tell you if you did really well or whether you're on next week. You know, so these seem like Dancing with the Stars, American Idol, yeah. Well, think about it. When they're 6 or 7, that might be the only judge they might be aware of. They call them judges. And now to the judges. Well, Nancy Grace, you were blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I look forward to seeing your interpretation of, I have dozens of others, and you may say similar ones. Please make those references again. I want you to learn homonym errors, auditory discrimination errors, and those are probably the only two fancy or linguistic phrases. The others, I'd be interested in hearing your interpretation of why the child gave that unusual response, and that'll be in your discussion board coming up. Any questions so far? Okay. Well, we're still looking at child development, and one of the things that we talked about, and that was part of the discussion board, was appreciating the impact or the relevance, or the importance of understanding child development for forensic interviewers. Why is that important? And you guys did a nice job, a real nice job, attacking that issue and teasing out all of the reasons why one ought to be appreciative of and understand and respect child development if you want to be a forensic interviewer. So if that's the case, we're just taking a look at some basic child development that might have some relevance to our forensic interviews. I'm not a social scientist or behavioralist or a psychologist, and I've learned a little bit about kids over the past many years, so we'll look at this together and kind of get a sense of where kids are. All of these guides are simply that. They're guides. There is tremendous amount of variability among children when it comes to their development. Kids develop at different stages. We can draw some conclusions about typical child development and where kids typically are at 6, 7, 8, 9, and so forth. But remember that these are not ironclad rules that govern how kids develop universally, okay? In fact, I would think that if you look at, and I happen to take a look at them globally, I looked at all your responses. When you see that spreadsheet from another class where they did your learning project 1 and talked to 6 and 7-year-olds, you'll see that kind of variability. I mean, you had 8-year-olds who go, I don't know. And you had a couple of 7-year-olds that said, an oath is a promise. So, the kids are at different stages of their learning and their development. And these are some of the general things. By 1 year of age, kids should be able to follow objects with their eyes, can recognize differences among people, respond to strangers by crying or staring, facial expressions. It's very simple directions. And we know kids can put blocks and shapes in toys and differentiate shapes a little bit. But just because kids are, their development is very rudimentary at age 1, and because they don't have language, doesn't mean that they can't communicate. What is a way that a child may communicate to us at 9 months? Crying. Who said that? Okay. Crying is one way that says something. Now, how do we interpret that crying, though? What does crying say? How do we interpret or understand what crying means? I agree with you. Crying says something. How do we know what it says, though, if we're a caregiver?
Different sounds.
The tone and the tone and the tenor, the type of crying, right, might tell us something. There's high-pitched wails, I imagine. There's squeals, there's murmuring, there's sobbing, there's different kinds of crying. What else informs us about the message from the child or the communication of the child about crying? What else? The tone.
Something's wrong.
Well, the message may be something's wrong, but what about the crying tells us something's wrong? We can listen to the tone and hey, something's wrong, but what's wrong?
Facial affect?
Their demeanor, their facial affect in conjunction with or along with the tone of the crying back there. Their body language, their mouth, what they're doing, and something called context, right? Their body language. If a child's arm is dangling lifeless to their side and they're crying and their face is all scrunched up, they can be saying, my arm hurts, right? And if there's a bottle or a cup of hot coffee spilled on the kitchen table and the child's grasping their hand and they're sobbing loudly, so context, affect, the tone, body language, all help us understand what that child is communicating. So kids communicate. Even at age 1, they can communicate to us in a lot of different ways. Between 1 and 2, kids can imitate the actions and words of adults. They can understand simple and familiar directions. And they get a little bit more accomplished in their linguistic abilities. But again, they are nonverbal. don't speak in sentences, they may speak in one words, and they may do that by mimicking. Between 2 and 3, they are able to respond still to simple directions. They can look at picture books, say one words, recognize themselves, maybe even say their name and those kinds of things. Very limited attention span, very limited attention span, and they learn through exploration and through the help of adults, right? But they become more communicative, let's put it that way. It's not until about 3 and 4, between 3 and 4, that kids can communicate through words a little bit, right? They can ask questions where they need information. They can even handle some why and how questions, but not too good at it. They know their own age, they know their own name. Obviously, they still have a short attention span. But they begin to put together short sentences and statements. And they begin to become aware, and this is important, of past and present. So pretty much up until age 4, kids really can't be interviewed. Now, there are forensic interviewers that attempt to interview kids 2 and 3. But in those cases, they are looking for the utterances of the kids and trying to interpret what they mean. But clarity doesn't come until much later. And it's not until about 4 that kids typically are able to give us a little bit of a narrative. Right? A narrative is putting a couple of sentences together that have meaning. Right? And if you're not aware of past and present, it's hard to give a statement for forensic reasons, for a courtroom. We don't interview, when I say we, the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office does not interview kids less than 3. We interview kids between 3 and 5 sparingly, once in a blue moon, for the obvious reasons. And it seems as though, up until very recently, and I've seen other examples, but after 17, 18 years investigating crimes on kids, I've heard many caregivers and many detectives and many interested parties say, but this 4-year-old is great. She's a baby genius. I say, well, these are baby genius cases. That's what I joke around in my office. Another baby genius we have. And, they may in fact be verbal. That's the word we use to describe kids who are able to form a short narrative, verbal. But to be verbal with strangers in a forensic interview context is quite a challenge for a preschooler. And what happens is, I think caregivers overestimate their own children's abilities, or whoever that person is. The caregiver overestimates that child's ability. Nevertheless, who is in the best position to interpret what preschoolers are communicating? What person in the whole planet? Is it the child's doctor? Is it the forensic interviewer? Is it a police detective or a child protective service worker? Who on the planet is in the best position to tell us and interpret and explore what that child means with their utterances? The parent. Or the caregiver. The person who's with that child most of the time. And that makes sense, right? I mean, what they mean is this. Okay, I mean, if you have kids, when you remember when they were real little, you know what they mean when they say and do things because you've seen them do it. I mean, we interpret the behaviors of our pets, right? And they're not verbal. No, not too verbal. Once in a while they say things that are... And I'm like, oh, look what he's saying. But when we're talking about preschoolers and, and we are their caregiver, we're interpreting not only their utterances but their behavior, because we have experience with that child. That is 2 or 3 years of experience. So they're in the best position, the caregiver. We're at a distinct disadvantage, forensic interviewers, when we talk to kids. Between 4 and 5, kids are very rote when it comes to numbers. Rote means mechanical. Rote means they can talk the talk, but they don't understand it. You know, they can parrot things. They can recite things back, but they don't have a grasp of the meaning of what they're saying. They may know their street and town. They're a little bit more focused and have a little bit more of an attention span. And their time concepts are expanding at 4 and 5. 5 and 6, now we get into kids who can give us a basic narrative in most cases. Chronology becomes better. Sequence becomes better. Now, these are things that are critical in forensics. These are things that are critical in legal proceedings, right? Before and after, during, when something happened, how long something occurred. And before 5, kids aren't very good at that. But now, 5 and 6, they can begin to appreciate clock time, chronology, sequence, and those kinds of things. Begin to understand them. The understanding of why things happen, or what we call cause and effect, begins to be understandable to kids about 5 or 6. And again, that's important if you want to get information from kids, that they understand cause and effect, or have some sense of it. And as is pointed out in your guide here, clock time, they can kind of relate to their daily schedule. Oops. Anything to add about that? Child development and children's typical abilities? All right. Well, we're going to look at a little bit different aspect of children's development, and that is kind of their cognitive development, the way they think, the way they see the world. We were just looking at a little bit of both, primarily language and general abilities. Let's focus a little bit on, the way they look at the world. Their thinking is very egocentric. This lasts a long time, sometimes many, many years. And what we simply mean here is that kids can really have a tough time taking the viewpoint of others. They see themselves as the center of the universe. They also believe that what they experience, everybody experiences. So until they get about 5, until they get a little bit older, sometimes 3 or 4 for many kids, but until they get around 5, and it may last even longer than that, they see themselves at the center of the universe. They have a tough time seeing themselves outside of their own body. They have a tough time seeing things from the perspective of others and taking another's viewpoint. And they have a tough time appreciating that we weren't there and that we don't know everything that happened to them. And that's important in a forensic interview because many preschoolers assume that we know it all. So when they respond to our questions, sometimes their responses are colored by their expectation that we already know all the answers. And we're just looking for validation. And that's what that video is about with the other interviewer that you saw last week, Fran, and we'll look at that in a moment. So kids are very egocentric, and they're thinking at 3 to 5, preschoolers. Their thinking is pre-logical. Why questions are woefully ineffective. And you know that if you've ever been a parent or dealt with a child, why did you stick the oatmeal in the DVD player? I don't know. Why did you break the lamp? Why did you, pour... My friend told me that his kid took a giant green magic marker and colored his penis green. He asked him why. You think he got a good response? You're not going to get a good response because there's no legitimate reason to paint your penis green with a large magic marker. So asking why is an exercise in futility. They don't really get logic, and they don't even get the logic of their own behavior. Never mind the logic of others. So why questions are problematic for a lot of reasons. We'll explore more about why later. They don't understand cause and effect, and sometimes they think two things occurred one after the other because that's the way they happened, not because I opened my umbrella because it began to rain. And their thinking can be syncretic, where they kind of fuse their experiences in one big blob of an event. And we'll talk more about that. Even their communication is egocentric. And that is, it goes back to what I said earlier, that the child doesn't know that the interviewer doesn't know. And because they're so egocentric, they believe the interviewer understands everything about their life. Their communication appears disorganized, it's personal and unstable, it can even be fanciful and improbable. Appear fanciful and improbable. But again, they understand the events from their perspective. By looking at those kids when we asked them questions about the legal system, there was a wide range of distorted responses because they didn't understand what we were saying, yet they didn't tell us that, they simply gave us an answer. So the root of where there's a communication breakdown may not be known to us as a forensic interviewer. The child may not be fantastic, they may not be psychotic or incompetent, they may just have not understood our question or a series of questions. Or they may have started out from a very different assumption than we started with. If you start out by thinking a court is somewhere you play basketball, and you're 7 questions down the line, and you're talking about basketball courts, and they're talking about a courtroom, and they start answering in ways that seem crazier and crazier, or more fanciful or more improbable, it may be a key that there was a breakdown somewhere, and it's not about, what I'm trying to say, it's not about the child's lack of competence. There could have been a breakdown 5 or 6 questions ago. So it says here, and this is true, it is important to explore hypotheses for these kids' accounts. They may be repeating what they have been told, or they may have understood events from their own perspective, or from a linguistic assumption that is false or erroneous, like we learned with our Learning Project 1. 5 to 7 kids are still egocentric, but a little less than 3 to 5. Their thinking becomes more concrete, but they still have difficulty with multiple topics. Although time becomes more adult-like for them, it's still poorly developed. So I just went over some of the highlights of cognitive development. You need to read those on your own, understand them. This is oral language development, and I'm going to get into language in detail in a future class. But one of the things I'll talk about, one of the things that we'll touch upon here is that kids learn in an environment, in a context. That's the way we learn language, and I'll talk about that in greater detail later. One of the things that I'd like to emphasize is, as as Celia Ganeshi emphasizes here, and that is constant correction of a child's speech is usually unproductive. Right here, where's this mouse? Ah, all right. Yeah, constant correction of the child's speech is usually unproductive. And the reason that is because they learn in a linguistic environment, kids. That's how you learn language. So if you keep telling them it's not, I go there before, it's I went there before, it's really not going to get the job done. Kids have an amazing aptitude for language, especially when they're young, and they'll learn eventually on their own. So constant correction is not productive usually. Children seem born not just to speak, but also to interact socially. Even before they use words, they use cries and gestures to convey meaning. And that's what we were talking about before. And this article goes into great detail about how kids acquire language. And we will talk in greater detail about that in a future class. This is a good article to read about child development in the forensic context. I'm not going to go over it, but we again have some typical exploration of kids in a forensic context and their ability. This was written for the National District Attorneys Association, Jennifer Massengale's article. So I would take a close look at that, and here's the interview chart that's very helpful. Yeah. And, you know, these are just general guidelines about kids' abilities. And it is really, really helpful to have an appreciation of these guidelines when you talk to kids. And when I get into forensic interview protocols, and when I get into the nuts and bolts of the Finding Words Corner House protocol, you will see that all protocols have to be efficient. And I think this Finding Words Corner House protocol is the most efficient. But it really is pointless to ask questions that are beyond a child's development. It is pointless to ask questions or engage in an inquiry simply because that's what the legal system demands. You can find the answers to things that the legal system demands often through other sources other than the words of the child. And to ask questions of a child that are beyond that child's competence is not a good idea for a few reasons. Let's take a look at them. Number one, it's inefficient. You could ask a 4-year-old how many times X happened or something happened all day. You will not get a reliable response. You'll get responses sometimes, but they won't be reliable. There'll be things like this many times. I have a video of my son, and I went and recorded it because I was mindful of these things. And I asked him how old Megazord was, some kind of character. Megazord. And he goes, he's this old. So I said, okay. And I didn't quite know what that meant. He's like older than this old, I guess, but not quite this old. So again, I didn't have a frame of reference, but he was talking in some other way. So you'll get things like, how many times did this happen? 122. Once. 25. Lots of times. 1,000,000. Right? So we can try to interpret what those responses mean, but they would just be our interpretation. We recommend, and when you hear me say we, I mean the Finding Words Child First protocol, which I'm an advocate of, once or more than once. And that serves us well, once or more than once. And then there's a way to kind of focus in on different times, and I'll teach that to you later. But back to how many times. Even a 5 and 6-year-old really can't give you how many times. The reason that's gray is many kids can give it to you, lots of kids can't. So to ask questions that are developmentally inappropriate is to inject inefficiency into your protocol or into your forensic interview. Because if you're spending 5 minutes messing around asking a child how many times when they are developmentally incapable of giving you a reliable answer, then you're wasting 5 minutes. So it's inefficient. Number 2, you are undermining the quality of your own interview and undermining the credibility of that child. Because to the average person, when you ask the child how many times did it happen, and they are developmentally incapable of giving you a reliable response, however they say 122, now you make that child look like they're not competent. You make that child look like they're not worthy of belief. No one believes that it happened 122 times. The average juror or the average judge that looks at that response realizes that that is just some kind of guesstimate by the child or some kind of statement by the child to express themselves about what happened without being realistic. So you, in a sense, undermine that child's credibility. You make them look like they're incompetent because you ask them for a question that's beyond their years when they are entirely competent for their age, precisely. Go ahead, you had your hand up.
This is like something that I want to take out in the field with me. You know, 'cause I know that sometimes when I interview children, they do give some answers that I'm like, what in the world are you talking about? But understanding that at a certain age, the younger the child, I may not get as much information as a 9 or 11-year-old child may be able to give me.
That's right.
And I think that a lot of times as investigators, when we go out, we want to get as much information from the child as possible. So I guess I just have to be more satisfied with what a 3-year-old child may give me versus what a 9-year-old child may be able to give me.
Yes. Yes. And not only should we be respectful of the child's ability, but we also should think about whether there are other sources of information other than the child. You know, sometimes, you know, something, if the kid goes, it happened at grandma's house. Well, tell me what street grandma lived on. Was grandma's house a big house or a little house? We can ask other people all the questions we want about grandma's house, you see? But when we start asking that child for information about grandma's house that may be relevant to our inquiry, you know, we are, number one, maybe asking the child for information that they can't give back to us. Or we may be taking time away from other questions that are important to this interview. You know, if there's a question that we don't need to ask the child, that we can get from another source, then don't waste time asking the child those questions. But you're right, this can be helpful in the field. I have index cards that I give to our staff that they use in the interview room or they keep in their desk. And, you know, they've understood that there are important reasons to pay attention to these issues. So number one, it's inefficient. Number two, by asking questions that are beyond the child's competence, when a child does give a kooky response, we are complicit in undermining their credibility, which simply means we're making them look like they're not competent. We are joining in and helping them look non-believable. Because the average person doesn't understand that sometimes kids give responses that are based on things other than whether it really happened or not, or that are based upon things other than their ability to communicate. We saw that from our Learning Project 1. Get all kind of unusual responses because the questions are beyond the child's ability, beyond their life's experience. So we undermine our own kids by asking questions that are beyond their competence. And the third important reason is when we do that and they give us 122 or they start talking about a basketball court when we're talking about a courtroom, we inject confusion into the equation. We inject complications into the equation. If we're misunderstood on question 3 and we're on a track, right? We're asking a series of questions about question 3 and we're 10 questions later, but the assumption on question 3 was faulty, like we're talking about a basketball, they're talking about a basketball court, and we're talking about a courtroom in a courthouse. You know, you may be 10 questions down the road before you figure that out. So you may inject confusion into the whole forensic interview, which is related to all these things. So you want to be mindful of children's development and their abilities.
Is the interview over when a child age 5, 6 has gives fantasy answers? Would you say
Well-
you should stop interviewing at that point?
Excuse me. Well, that's a good question, and we tackle that later. But it's worth addressing now, and we'll revisit it later, and we might even have some video clips later. The question was, when a child starts giving fanciful or fantastic responses, do you shut the interview down then? And the general rule is no. What you need to do is think about that response and ask the question a different way. Look, if you say, where was Grandpa when Grandma was doing X to you? And she says, I like pancakes with chocolate chips in them. That's the equivalent of not saying anything at all, right? It's a non-response, but it's in some ways worse. It seems bizarre and improbable. So we know there's a linguistic breakdown there. We know there's an interview breakdown there. So what we need to do is, even when a child gives us an improbable or fantastic response, or when a kid is non-responsive, we simply need to change the question around because there is a communication breakdown there. So what we recommend is when there's a communication breakdown, we need to switch around the question. Sometimes a kid will just stare at you, or sometimes a kid will give you an unusual or fantastic response. We need to reformulate the question. And we don't really need to know exactly what it was. Maybe it was a language issue, maybe it was the tone of my voice, maybe there was a breakdown earlier in the interview. But if you switch the question around, sometimes it remedies the response. On the other hand, sometimes the fantastic response is responsive, but improbable. Like, what happened when Grandpa touched you on your coochie? I took him in the basement and I beat him with a hammer until the blood came out. Okay, we know that that is implausible. Sometimes kids say things that are impossible. You know, I flew away out the window and went in Grandma's lap. So what we say is, or what we recommend saying is, well, you know, Jerry, is that something that really happened? Because at the beginning we say we tell the truth here and that's what really happened. So you want to kind of track that kind of agreement that we made at the beginning of the interview. Well, Jerry, is that something that really happened, or is that something that you felt like doing? And they may say, no, it really happened. It really happened that you flew out the window and landed in Grandma's lap? Uh-huh. Well, then you may have a child that's got some competence issues. More often than not, it is a psychological coping mechanism when you get these wacky responses. And you need to be aware of that. Or it may be a child who's expressing themselves in the only way they know how. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but some cases that have been reported in the literature can give us some guidance. There was a case where a child said that after the man molested her, he walked through the wall into the other room. Now, to the interviewer, this sounds like something that's impossible, that the molester turned into a ghost or some apparition, was able to walk through the wall. But further investigation revealed that there was, another room that was being framed, and the person simply walked through where the wall would have been. It was a room under construction. So sometimes follow-up questions can get to the heart of that. Tell me more about that. Did he walk through the wall or around the wall? Just ask follow-up questions and don't end the interview. And even if they stick to an implausible assertion, I wouldn't end the interview. I would never end the interview unless the child is actively having a traumatic experience or engaging in behaviors that are injurious or to themselves or to someone else. Because even though they stick to their bizarre or fanciful response, we may not know the reason why. Maybe you can't shake the kid from saying the kid walked through the wall. And then we later learn what they meant. So by ending the interview, we've lost this opportunity to find out more facts. The one thing that you shouldn't do, and many investigators have done in the past, is drop it. Don't address it at all. So what happened next? I flew out the window and landed in Grandma's lap. Okay, and then move on. There's no time like the present to address that fantastic statement. Now's when the kid said it. Now's when the kid could probably expand on it a little bit. Now's when the kid looks incompetent. If you move on and leave that fantastic statement dangling, it doesn't get any better. And you're never going to be able to go back in time to address exactly what's going on in that child's thought process. That statement's not going away. Don't leave that for someone else to mop up next year or next month or next week or whenever. And if you don't document it, you're being unprofessional and may even be committing an offense. I mean, that is something that ought to be documented. If it's not a video recorded statement, you need to document something like that. So if you say, well, the child said he flew out the window and landed in Grandma's lap, and then I went on to ask, well, how did it feel on your body when he touched you? I just ignored it. Much like the video, it's not going to go away. And the worst time to address it's in some courtroom someday and speculate about what the child meant. Now's the time to ask the child what they meant. And you will find that in many cases, it's not as fantastic as you thought. I may have video clips, and if I don't, I'll get you some. I have a clip of an interviewer going, okay, and simply moving on. And then I have a clip of an interviewer saying, well, is that something that really happened or something you felt like doing? And the kid goes, well, that's what I wanted to do to him. It was about punching him or bloody nose or something like that. I think the videos are here, actually. We'll see them later. Okay?
Can you ever go with the fantasy, or is that for a psychologist to do at that point? Is that where you have to find fact?
Well, we don't really want to go too far with the fantastic statement if they continue on that fantastic statement. I think for a forensic interviewer, you want to find out more information about that. You want the child to expand on that a little bit so that we can judge at the time of the interview what we think is going on, and maybe address it later in the interview or address it now, or maybe address it in therapy. But this is not the time to go off on that in that direction, because remember, we don't want to undermine the kid's credibility. And if the kid keeps making, scaffolding, to use a word that you learned, and you don't want the kid to scaffold and build on this fantastic statement even more than we need to. If it's some kind of coping mechanism, we'll let the psychologist, if we ever wind up in court with a case like this, we'll let the psychologist explain it. On the other hand, I don't recommend leaving it there dangling. I recommend, finding out a little bit more about what motivated the child, you know, or if, as an experienced interviewer, we get the sense that it is a coping mechanism, we get the sense it's something that they wanted to do, then we identify that in the middle of the interview. But I would not go off in the direction of the fantastic statement too far. Yes?
Now, how do interview techniques differ when children have developmental delays, learning disabilities?
Well, there's an article, and we spend some time, not a heck of a lot, but some time on kids who have developmental disabilities. And there's a podcast, I believe. I did an interview with Rachel Heath, who's a colleague of mine, and you may see some of her videos where she addresses those kind of things. It's not exactly the same as talking to a preschooler or a small child, but there are a lot of similarities, and you'll listen to that podcast and get a sense of it. You know, you need to understand what that child's ability is. Like all children of limited ability, whether it be because of their immaturity or because they have some kind of cognitive impairment but are chronologically older, you need to be careful. You need to ask short, simple questions. You need to be concrete. You know, the kinds of same things you do with children. But there are a couple of other little techniques that are relevant to developmentally delayed kids that you'll hear about in our podcast.
And is that provided in the Finding Words training?
No, we don't focus on developmentally delayed children. No. That's not what Finding Words is about. That doesn't mean that the same strategies can't be used with developmentally delayed kids. Like I just said, they're very similar, but the focus on here is not on what is impairing the child, but what their development is. So we interview kids, and Finding Words prepares people for interviewing 12-year-olds who are developmentally delayed. And having a sense of their intellectual ability is important for the interviewer before they go into the interview. So, you know, if you go in to an interview with a 12-year-old who has the intellectual functioning of a 5-year-old, you're going to have to use the similar strategies that you might use for a 5-year-old, right? But there are other kind of developmental disabilities and other kinds of disabilities that are very specific, that are beyond Finding Words. Like my colleague Rachel Heath has a lot of knowledge about Asperger's syndrome and some other very distinct developmental and cognitive issues. Now, you need to understand kids, you know, how kids communicate with Asperger's syndrome, autism. There's a lot of different levels of functioning among autistic kids, and there's a lot of different kinds of research in that area. We don't, in Finding Words, we don't go over that kind of stuff. And that's, if you're going to interview that kind of child, you need a special interviewer who knows how Asperger kids communicate. And, you know, I forget what some of the things they are, whether they tend to be fanciful, or they do this, or they do that, or they act. There's a whole way that some of these kids act, and that experts know. So this doesn't address that, the Finding Words. Any other questions? All right. Let's take a look at, it's always fun to look at some concrete, could you hit that light, please? Some concrete examples. Now, for whatever reasons, my introduction isn't playing on this video clip. I think because it might be the right or the left channel. I'm not sure. But that's cool, because I've already told you this about being concrete and literal, so we're just going to hear Giselle's interview. It's a little snippet of this interview, and revisit it. This is the underwear boxers conundrum.
You said keep hold your pants down. Do you wear something under your pants? Do you wear something under your pants?
Great question, right? Remember, these interviewers are taught not to make assumptions, right? It's not leading. A leading question tells the listener what? The answer. It is not a leading question to ask a police officer, was he carrying something in his hand? Now, it's focused, it's suggestive, but a strict definition of leading tells the person the answer. I don't know if it's a flashlight or a gun or a baton. I don't know if it's right or left hand. I don't know what it is. So here the interviewer's not assuming anything. He's got pants on, that's already been established. She's trying to find out if he was wearing something under his pants. That's this underwear issue we talked about earlier.
You mean under my underwears? No.
He says, you mean under my underwears? So he's thinking a third layer of clothing, right? She's asking whether he wore something under his clothes, I think. And then he says, you mean under my underwears? And this is the beginning of some communication breakdown. And I don't have the beginning. I probably should have had a few more questions that lead up to this. But it sounds like they got off track somewhere else. And that's why they kind of get back on track in a little bit. But it's interesting to watch.
Huh? Do you wear something under your pants?
You mean under my underwears? No.
Okay. Do you wear underwears?
Yes. And boxers.
And boxers. Okay. Now, how were you wearing boxers and underwear that day?
And here's where the interviewer, she's not seeing or hearing what's happening here, that these are two distinct things. Because she's being very literal, right? And then we teach them that. You know, you have to recite back. He goes, he doesn't say I was wearing underwears and boxers, but he says underwears and boxers. And she says, were you wearing underwears and boxers that day? As if that's a single entity to the boy. I think she's missing it. Let's look at that again.
Or your pants?
You mean under my underwears? No.
Okay. Do you wear underwears?
Yes. And boxers.
And boxers. Okay.
Now, she's asking a general question. Do you wear underwears? And she probably should be saying, were you wearing underwears
Yeah.
when Grandpa, whatever's happening here? So she's asking, do you wear underwears? Right? Isn't that her question?
Yes.
Yeah. A general answer. And he's more precise than her. He's giving her a general response. I wear underwears and boxers. You know, it depends on the day and, you know what I'm doing. Look at it from the beginning.
You said you pulled your pants down. Do you wear something under your pants?
Huh?
Do you wear something under your pants?
You mean under my underwears? No.
Okay. Do you wear underwears?
Yes. And boxers.
And boxers. Okay. Now, how were you wearing boxers and underwear that day?
I wasn't wearing. I was wearing underwear.
You were wearing underwear. Okay. So you said he took your pants down. How were your underwear when he tried to do this to you? How were your underwear when Todd tried to do this to you?
It had Power Rangers on it.
It had Power Rangers on it. Okay, I'm gonna write that down too.
So we saw how the word how, we talked about that earlier, was confounding to the child, it was confusing to the child, and you know what she was trying to do. She was trying to find out, without being leading or suggestive, you know, where was underwear? How were your underwear? What state were your underwear in? But that answer, they had Power Rangers on them, is legitimate. How were your underwear? They're kind with the Power Rangers on them. And you can see him struggling, although it's blurred. You can feel him struggling to give you a response. And the reason I call this concrete and literal, there's a lot of things going on here in 7 questions, right? A lot of things going on. Imagine in a 500 question interview, you need to kind of get closer to this than like this. But my point was, which I found interesting, was boxers and underwear are 2 different things, right, to him.
But she seemed to really get that too, at some point. When he said, I wasn't wearing boxers, I was wearing underwear.
Right.
And then she sort of understood that there was this difference between the two things and went with that.
Yes, no, I think she got it. Yeah, yeah. Not in the very beginning, though. The first,
Right.
yeah.
She pulled it back around.
Now, this is just a wonderful example of cognitive egocentricity. We just talked about that a little while ago, remember? And these things are important because we need to be able to address these issues on the fly. We need to understand them and understand the consequences of these child development issues so that when we do interviews, we can understand when they manifest themselves and address that issue. If we know that kids are very concrete and literal, then Giselle needs to be ready to address that when the underwear boxers issue arises and says to herself, although it happens in a millisecond in her brain, I know what's happening now. To him, underwear and boxers are two different things. He's being very literal. Let me be very specific. Let me use his language. Cognitive egocentricity. If a child believes that you were there, or that you know everything that happened to them, or all adults know everything that happened to them, because my experience is a shared experience with the world. And that's really how these real little kids feel and think about the world. I remember a kid, I tried a sexual assault case where a guy molested a girl in Eastside Park, a little 8-year-old or 7-year-old girl, and the cops rolled up on them at about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and there was a chase, and I'll mention this case later, but when that girl was being interviewed, you know, she was saying to the interviewer, when the interviewer asked, you know, like what neighborhood was in, she's like, by Scooby-Doo's. What's that? Scooby-Doo, it was by Scooby-Doo's. You don't know Scooby-Doo's? I don't know Scooby-Doo's. You don't know Scooby-Doo's. Like everybody knows Scooby-Doo's, that everybody lives in her neighborhood. Scooby-Doo's, someone know what Scooby-Doo's is?
Isn't it like a store in Hawthorne on Goffle Road?
Yes, it's in the Hawthorne-Patterson border. What kind of store?
Ice cream?
Yeah, it's an ice cream store, Scooby-Doo's. I didn't know that until I went to the scene, till I looked into it. Scooby-Doo's. But she was puzzled that the interviewer on everybody knows Scooby-Doo. This kid's a little younger. And the remedy is to frequently say to small kids, I don't know, I wasn't there.
Right.
You know? And you'll see interviewers do that from time to time. You need to do that differently. I mean, you need to do that liberally, not differently. You need to do that liberally. And you need to do that with preschoolers and small children as much as possible. Not when there's a manifestation of cognitive egocentricity, because you don't know whether they're limiting their responses or whether they're giving you a certain response because they assume you know the answer. You see, you don't know when the child is holding back. If we say, tell me all about that, and they give you this much because they assume you know that much, that you know most of it, then they may not be giving it all to you. You don't always know when cognitive egocentricity or the child's belief that you know everything that happened is hurting the interview or reducing the amount of factual information you get. Sometimes it bites you on the butt like this kid. But sometimes it doesn't. So what do? You say, you know, Gabriella, you told me that Uncle Manuel came in your room and he touched you on your butt when Mommy was sleeping. I wasn't there and I don't know how that happened. So I want you to tell me the first thing Uncle Manuel did when he got in the room, when he touched you the first time. And blah, 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 blah. You told me that this happened, Gabriella. Now, I don't know because I wasn't there that day. What happened next? Liberally sprinkle these statements that communicate to the child that you weren't there, you don't know what happened, so they get that message clearly. And that's how you try to neutralize the impact of cognitive egocentricity. To give you a sense of that happening, we have this video clip here. Now this, I need to lower the volume, I think it's very loud. Now, this is Francine, was another one of our interviewers. And, you know, she's just kind of mellow. Okay, I don't know your teacher. I don't know this one. I don't know them. I wasn't there. You know, I don't know these people. Tell me more. And that's pretty much the way to handle these issues.
But she yells at me.
Who?
My teacher,
Which one?
the mean one. She's mean. She's like, sit down.
Which teacher is that?
She's mean.
What's her name?
This is terrifying.
Caraface is mean. She knows I need to sit down.
You have seen it before? You were at school last night?
No, I haven't met her.
Why not? She's your friend?
No, she's not my friend. I don't know who she is.
You know who my teacher is, Miss Tripp?
No, I don't know who any of your teachers are.
You know my friend's name?
I just know you and your mom.
And you don't know my friend's name?
Who's your friend?
Isis.
Isis, no, don't know him.
Huh?
I don't know him.
Now, you know, she may have said other things like, I don't know any of your friends because I live where I live and you live where you live and I don't know these people. Or she needs to know, see, this is the cue for later on in the interview. She needs to really use liberal statements that I wasn't there, I don't know what happened, I don't know everything that happened, you told me this, I wasn't in the room that night. This is a child that you need to do that throughout the interview, to keep them on track, to keep them focused on the issue of as many facts as possible, that you need as many facts as possible, and that you weren't there.
Now with her, I guess, her actions, her physical actions with the video, since it was raining, because she lowered her body,
Mm-hmm.
was that more to adapt towards the child and give him eye contact, or was she just bored?
No, I don't think she's bored, but, you know, I'm not sure what,
Like, you know the actual video in itself.
oh, I don't remember I've seen thousands of videos. I mean, I don't remember the beginning and the end and what the outcome was, or who that boy was, or who got charged or didn't get charged, but, you know, I'm not sure what, if Fran kind of was, I don't think she was bored, I think she was just trying to be informal and kind of mirror, not exactly mirror the child, but mirror the, you know, kind of bring her tone down and kind of be informal. And I think she had her hand like this, Fran, for part of it, yeah. You could put the light back on, thank you.
No, I think there was a impasse. I don't think that they were getting quite certain.
I'm sorry,
I think there was an impasse, that it seems to me. Impasse?
an impasse?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not understanding what you mean by that.
I think they were stuck at where they were, the kid thinking she knows everybody that he knows, and I'm not sure they were getting anywhere.
Well, again, this was 20 seconds here. You know, I don't know what happened before or after. I think you're right. I think that, you know, the question is, what was Fran trying to get the child to talk about? I don't know. The teacher was relevant. I'm not sure what it was, but, you know, whether things could have been done differently. Look, there's no such thing as a perfect interview. Take my word. There's only the best interview we can do, and there's only an interview where we minimize, you know, mistakes and questions that, you know, impair our ability to get the most facts and the highest quality facts or information. If we listen to the beginning of this and we listen to afterwards, we may find out what the teacher had to do with everything. And, you know, this was just a second where Fran was being very matter of fact and, you know, and listening, letting the kid talk and letting the kid know, I don't know these people. And what his teachers had to do with anything, I'm not sure. Go
It
ahead.
sounds like she was building rapport with the child, really. that she was just listening to him and, you know, getting to know who the different teachers were and whatnot. Are you gonna have a session on building rapport with the child? So that
Yeah, but that's, we don't build rapport that way, but
Okay.
that's,
You mean asking questions is not part of rapport building? It's-
well, not those kinds of questions,
Okay.
but that's not what was happening here.
Okay.
This was probably something relevant to his telling. Maybe he disclosed in school, maybe it involved a janitor or somebody at a daycare, the accused, I'm not sure. It's was not part of rapport building. Because we have a very specific kind of rapport building. It involves the drawings, it involves certain questions. Our rapport building is serves two purposes. It builds rapport and it also gathers information at the same time. You know, that doesn't mean we don't ask a question or two about their teacher or stuff, but you'll hear more about that later. But one thing you'll find is, and I was struck by this, when I learned the protocol that I embraced in 1999, and I've seen many of the forensic interviewers from the Corner House program in Minneapolis, St. Paul throughout the years. And one of the things that always struck me about them was, you know, how flat their tone is, and how almost bland their interviews are. You know, sometimes their voice may go up or down a little bit, but they're just like Fran. They're, okay, and what happened next, and what happened next, and inexperienced interviewers, and some interviewers, and you'll see it with Fran and Giselle, and you'll see it with Rachel in some of our clips, where they kind of get overly enthusiastic at times. And that's not the way these professional interviewers work. They're very matter of fact, bland. They don't get too high, they don't get too low. Nothing phases them. You know, they're very kind of matter of fact. They're very even keeled in their approach, and patient. And they listen. And they're kind of the way Fran was. No, I don't know that person. No. Novice interviewers tend to go in and go, wow, okay. And, you know, people who talk to kids tend to raise the pitch of their voice and get giddy and, oh, wow, that's great. You're in the 3rd grade. Wow, blah, 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 blah. We don't do that in these interviews. And, well, the thing is, you're less likely to be suggestive if you don't vary the tone of voice. Suggestion can arise from words, from actions, from behavior, from our voice, from the tone of our voice, and that's one reason why we don't do it. We just want to facilitate what they have to say. That doesn't mean you can't show a little bit of emotion now and then and vary the pitch of your voice, but there's not a lot of, wow, you know, there's not a lot of the way we see lay people speak to kids, you know? Go ahead.
I guess you were starting to answer my question, like, why is it that it's so matter of fact and so bland? And I was gonna ask, is it because I noticed that with kids, when you entertain them in that way, then you're just kind of adding to more, sometimes to the fanciful thinking and kind of lose focus as to, you know, to get into where you want to get. Is that one of the reasons why they want to keep it so mellow, to just kind of stay more focused and on target?
Yeah, no, I think you characterized it well. I think that when you get into that, I mean, this is not playtime. And we reinforce that throughout the investigative interview and the forensic interview. I mean, when we introduce dolls, I'll show you how we do that, and we tell them, look, these aren't dolls we play with. These are dolls that help me talk to kids. We want to let them know that this is important. And what we do in here is we tell the truth, and the truth is what really happened. And the way that we interact with the child should reinforce the solemnity, how solemn, how important this is. And this isn't, you know, lots of times adults do get frivolous and fanciful with kids. It's very rare that you talk to a kid this age for more than 3 minutes without joking around, or you know, how often are you that serious with a child? You're not. Kids like to play. They like to goof around. And you know, the other thing is, as pointed out here, you know, there's a lot of danger in how we vary our voice and our tone and all that, because it can be perceived as suggestive if we become more animated. Now I want to talk about Dad. Oh, and school's fun, and you have a pony? Wow, lots of kids have ponies. I wish I had a pony. What's your pony's name? The ponies are great. Ponies are this. Let's talk about Dad. Does he come in your room? I mean, I'm being a little silly here, but, you know, you keep an even keel. You don't focus or emphasize one thing over the other. You communicate with the child. You maintain the solemnity of the interview, that it's formal, that it's important, that it's serious. I think it's more professional and better suited for these interviews, and you know, and I find that to be, you know, and you know what? If you do that, you don't run into this, because if you train yourself to be consistent, and you know, your emotions kind of run this gamut rather than this gamut, and the way that your tone goes, kind of like this, because then when you get, you know, when you get statements like. And then what happened next? Oh, I sucked his cock. Okay, you know, or you don't have to say anything like, all right, you know, when they make a wacky statement or a statement that's disturbing, right? You don't want to go, okay, all right, you know, you're okay, and what happened next? You know? So, and you'd be surprised. I'll show you many clips where children have used graphic statement, have expressed graphic statements of human sexuality that can be jarring to the interviewer. And you'll see some good examples where the interview is not jarred, you know. But if you keep an even keel, you won't emphasize one thing over the other, and you won't communicate how you feel about things. You'll see a video where the kid goes, and how did it feel in your body? It felt good. What happened? What about the molest? I liked it. And we'll talk more about that and what that all means, but some interviewers go, you liked it? It felt good? I mean, the slightest change in our demeanor, our affect, and our tone can communicate things to kids. And we don't want our tone or demeanor to have a chilling effect on the kid, too. You know? Is there a reason you didn't tell? You know, you want to watch how we communicate our questions to the kids. So I think you're less likely to get into problem areas if you keep a kind of even-keeled, even tone. Any other observations or questions about this? Okay, let's take a look at a couple things before we go. Learning module.
I have a question for the discussion forum.
Uh-huh.
If you post your opinion and also address one of the other classmates' opinions in one forum, is that fine?
No, I'll address that in a second.
Okay.
Let's. This is your next learning module. You're going to begin and complete over the next 2 weeks. Okay. So there's required reading, right? There's some video clips I want you to look at, just like the ones we just looked at. There's a video lecture here, and this is optional, because I'm going to do this lecture live here. I'm going to go over these slides live. So this is really for the online class. You're not in the online class, so you don't have to watch this, okay? So this lecture, you don't have to watch, because I'm going to present that PowerPoint presentation over the next 2 weeks. You might want to take a look at the PowerPoints, because they're there, okay? And I'm gonna go over them just like this. I'll be presenting this and talking about it, okay? But if you wanna take a peek at the PowerPoints, you can. You don't need to watch this video lecture. Your Learning Module 3 discussion board has to do with what I talked about earlier. Here it is. We're going to look at the results here. I'll open that. Now that should open. Yeah, this is a collection of spreadsheet of kids' responses, okay, from a different class, where you're going to kind of have the discussion in the discussion boards that we had here today. Right? Talk about what might have motivated that response. Try to get into why kids gave a response that was non-responsive or something like that. So there are results in there, and you're going to talk about that in the discussion board. And that discussion board postings are due October 13th and October 17th. So I'm not sure how you can do that anyway. But what I want you to do is I want you to post at or about October 13th, no later than October 13th, some observation you made. And then between October 13th and October 17th, look at how the discussion's developing and make some other posting or some other comment about some other aspect of this discussion. I don't want you to make one posting and go, hey, I think this, and Jerry's observation from yesterday is really important too. I want you to get in discussion. I want separate postings. Okay.
I think I understand where she's getting, because I know that
Yeah, I
number
think that-
2, the question for number 2, I think towards the end it asked like, what is your response to other people's opinions? And I don't know if that was a trick question, so I only put my form and then replied afterwards, because it was, it was basically saying reply to someone else's response.
Right.
So that's where it got confusing for that one.
Right. Well, this one says post at least one response to the posts of another student. Well, let me just tell you, and that may have been poorly worded, I'm sure it is, but here's what I'm driving at here. I simply don't want you to post once. I want you to post twice. In the second posting, I want you to react to some other student's idea. Simple as that, if that's simple. So you have some idea, and then somebody else goes, oh, about some other issue. I want you to get involved in some other discussion. Because you know what happened in the beginning when I first did this, I had students posting, and there would be 24 separate posts. It wouldn't be a discussion. It would just be, I think this, a bunch of I think this, which is okay, but I kind of want you to communicate. I want you to interact with one another. That's what I'm driving. That's what the hope is by creating this two-tiered system. Learning Project 1 is moot, so it really doesn't belong here. That's done already. Yeah. Now, I don't know if I emphasized this. This is Safari. Not sure how to get full screen in Safari, but anyway. This link here on the left, well, it's not making it on the screen, but Chad Resources, right there by my thumb. There's a number of videos here, so if you find, you should watch this orientation video. I made that point in one of the announcements. And even though it speaks in terms of the online course, the same issues are involved, so ignore the online stuff. But there are other things here. I think I showed you this or told you about it. Forwarding your email to a personal account, using the discussion boards in Blackboard 9, and some people had a tough time submitting assignments. This video tells you how to do that. And there's a couple of other things here. But take a look at this just to get a sense of what's there, because you may have a question that's answered already there. Okay, kind of a FAQs video page. Any other questions or observations? Okay, let's get out of here then, okay? End class a little bit early.